Good evening. Is anyone out there? We're in competition with Riverfest and all sorts of things happening, so we're a little sparse, but we're all here. More than registered showed up, so that's even better. This week was the last week for our intern, Jonathan, that was here last program. So today was his last day. He's headed back to school, but the museum will still be open Wednesday through Friday with Matt running downstairs in case you want to come in and visit. So feel free to stop by and check it out and till the end of August. That's pretty much what's going on right now. Denise is always looking for research people in the research library, so feel free to stop in and check out what needs to be looked at in the research library. We've had a lot of people come back this year now that the pandemic was over, and so we've had a good summer this year of people coming out and checking out what we have. So this month we have a program that we had originally scheduled for last year, and we put that off until this year. So we were glad we were able to have it back. And Ellen Williams has the book, which she will be talking about tonight, and the name of the program, Out of the Woods from Deerfield to the Grand Circuit. And it should be interesting. So we'll have her come at this time.
Hi there. Can you hear me at the right level? Okay, all right. First of all, I would like to thank Matt and Denise for helping me with my research. I spent a day, I phoned ahead from Tioga County. My home is in Knoxville. And I phoned ahead I think it was about 5 years ago, and spoke with Denise, and she had pulled things out for me, and I spent an afternoon here. And many of the tidbits that developed into one of the chapters in the book was largely drawn from the really good sources, primary sources that I found here in the collection. So that's kind of a thank you back to the Historical Society and the museum for what they do. So I just wanted to say that right up front. So my name is Ellen Williams, and we are, my husband Craig and I, Craig is in the blue shirt there, we drove over from Tioga County tonight. And so it's about an hour drive. And I wanted to start by showing you, and I'm going to move this around here. How many of you have gone to the Troy Fair to the horse races? A couple of you have gone. How many of you like horses? Okay. Horses in history, horsepower, horse-drawn era, historical topics, things like that. So the Troy Fair, I have not been to the Troy Fair to the horse races myself. I didn't know anything about harness racing. I grew up on a dairy farm. I had a riding pony, and I did not know much of anything about harness racing. But during my adventures as a child with my horse and pony, my family would say to me sometimes that there had been horses in our family. And one horse in particular's name kept coming up, and that horse was a stallion. So I didn't do anything about it until one day one of my cousins asked me, is this sort of legend thing that we heard about this horse that our fifth great grandfather had, is there really something to it, or is it just family pride and legend? So I decided to try to find out. I had about 3 clues, so I'll show those clues to you tonight. But I haven't been to the Troy Fair to the horse races. When I started to research harness horse racing, which is really different than the Kentucky Derby style that typically gets more on TV, we went some other places to watch horse races, but I haven't been to the Troy Fair. I have been to Alperon Park to see the lovely carriage display there in the vintage stable barns. And they have a variety of rigs there that I recognized as I began to delve into the topic of the horses. So Troy Fair has a really, really strong tradition, long tradition of having harness races, good harness races, and and they don't anymore. I don't think they have them anymore, but they kept them a really long time. The closest fair now that you can really see a current harness race at, the closest one I believe is Steuben County Fair in Bath. You can go there, and again, it isn't like it used to be. But I will move along here through this slideshow. Okay, so I'm just going to turn this a little bit here so that, no, it's on a timer, Craig. I don't want to do that. I think I don't want to do that. I want to, okay, thank you. So one of the interesting things I found, when I was a child, I read a book called Born to Trot, which is a storybook about a horse, written by Marguerite Henry, and she wrote lots and lots of, she wrote Misty of Chincoteague and lots of books, and one of them is called Born to Trot. And in the Born to Trot story, she presents the story of Risdix Hambletonian, and he was he became a very famous trotting stallion. And I found that there was one here in Towanda during the horse race era, and he was named Towanda. And he was owned by a man named John, and I guess Montagna, and he was in Towanda. I don't know that Towanda panned out particularly well. I did not find much evidence of Towanda horses or livestock racing much in my research. But there was a horse named Towanda, and he would be like a cousin, a relative to the horse that I wrote my story about. At the beginning of the Civil War, my fifth great-grandfather moved from New Jersey. I was quite astonished to find out that he came from New Jersey. Some people teased other people about being from New Jersey, and we were always told in the family they were from New York State. But they were from the corner right where New York meets New Jersey meets Pennsylvania. So they really were, the family was living in both New York and New Jersey. He brought a young stallion with him when he came here at the beginning of the Civil War in 1861. The young colt was 2 years old, and he was bred from the line of Risdix Hambletonian from Marguerite Henry's story. And Risdix Hambletonian had a lot of offspring, and some of them went to Kentucky on the eve of the Civil War and had various adventures, good and bad, in Kentucky. The Civil War was a really very volatile time for both humans and pedigreed livestock. So this is a breeding card. It's showing a little faint up there on the screen, but it's basically an advertising business card. They didn't have a way to reproduce a photograph at that time, so they would hand these cards out to their friends. And this one was one that had been kept at our local public library. It was not in our family. But it's dated 1882, and it has the names of two of the Wood men in it. So at this point, this horse was older, but he arrived in Tioga County with his dairy farmer master in 1861. He was handled by a number of different members of the Wood family. And we were always told a very simplified story about how the horse was brought by the father. And when he brought his whole family, including all of his sons, he brought the horse along with him. And then he just gave the stallion as a gift to the one son. And that was really all we were ever told. And this picture is all we ever saw. So during the time I was growing up, there was this one picture and the breeding card that hung in our local public library. had been donated by a relative in a previous generation that I never overlapped with. But this was a picture of this stallion that came as a 2-year-old colt. And he raced a number of races. I do not know the location of the picture, but he was known as Dan. And it's a very simple name. The family always called him Dan, but as with many famous horses or horses that have a pedigree, he had a proper name and then he had a home name. So his nickname was always Dan, or Dan Jr., or something relating to Dan. They called him Old Dan by the time that they were talking to me about him. But his name was Woods Hambletonian. Very original. They took the Hambletonian and they put the name of the guy in front, and there were dozens of these stallions around in the Northeast. This picture cropped up early in my search. So one of my cousins challenged me to find out whether or not is this really real? Is it legend or is it real? Can you find anything that really tells us there really was some fame to this horse? Is there any reality to these claims that this horse was famous? And then one of my other cousins began to clean out the attic of one of her ancestors, and she brought this to me one day. It was a stereopticon card, so it had side-by-side images. And the quality was not good. It had been stapled or tacked to some kind of outside barn office wall or something. It was covered with fly dirt, and you can see that it's quite damaged. You can barely make out what's going on here, but you can see that the rig is a really, really light 2-wheeled racing rig, and the horse is a lightweight, petite horse, not a draft horse, and they are at some kind of, fancy place with a gazebo and a double-decker stand. So they're somewhere, not around our house, for sure. And on the back of the stereopticon, someone had written in fountain pen, Nancy Hackett. And I had never heard of Nancy Hackett, and I had no idea what year or anything about what Nancy Hackett was. And at first I didn't think there was any connection, and then I thought, well, if it was saved all these years, maybe there is some kind of connection. But I had to do a lot more digging before I made the connection from Nancy Hackett to my ancestor's horse. This is one of those atlas centerpieces from the Allegheny County, New York atlas, and these atlases were very popular. I think there was one done in Bradford County, and there's one right after the Civil War. They were really, really popular, all these atlases, and typically they would have these engravings or penciled pen and ink drawings of an artist's rendering of some kind of popular location. And this, you can kind of get from this that this was a very popular place. These people are all kind of gathered down here, and there's obviously the crowd is merged down here to this corner, and it's surrounded by a racetrack around the outside. This one was in Cuba, New York, and these were pretty plentiful all over. And Cuba, New York is more than an hour north of Knoxville, where we live. But I began to dig around and discovered that some of the sons and daughters of the Hambletonian horse the Woods were breeding, first they'd go to Addison, Jasper, and places around Knoxville. And then when they got a little more well-known and they started to win races, they would take them up to Cuba and Addison, western New York. So Cuba was a big attraction for all kinds of harness racing. This is a poor quality picture, has a big old shadow across the top, but it's another one of those really, really rare pictures of the stallion with one of the woodmen. I don't know which one. He's in the shade, but the stallion the conformation is pretty similar. And the other thing that I notice here, which I noticed in the other picture too, is, and I'm not an expert about horses, but he stands with his hind feet pretty far back. So his his hips are lean, and he naturally stands with his hindquarters kind of naturally standing back, which may give him a bit of power back there. He also has pretty heavy shoulders and a crest on his neck, so we can tell that he is a stallion. In the 1880s, after the Woods Hambletonian horse had gotten somewhat more well-known, people were driving their mares all over the dirt roads to go to Knoxville to be bred to Woods Hambletonian. There was a man in Elmira who was a pharmacist, and he was part of the Flood family. And the Floods were into a lot of politics. I believe one of them was a mayor, one of them was a postmaster. Many of them were doctors. And they lived in the moving and shaking society of Elmira. And Thomas Flood was one of the many Flood men in the family. And he had gone to medical school, but he became a pharmacist, and he ran a drugstore on East Water Street in Elmira for many years. And he kept his pharmacy. They called him a druggist back then. I don't know what all the difference in the credentials were, but they called him a druggist. So he was known, and he was well enough known in society to get his portrait in the Chemung County history book here. So we did some research with Steuben County folks, and they provided us with this image of him. I also have another. If you look him up on Wikipedia, you'll find more of a picture portrait, which is over on the table. So he was very well connected in Elmira, and he loved horses. And for a while, he kept his horses in Elmira. But when his hobby with horses became more than just what he could support in his city residential block, he had to expand and buy a farm. And he bought a farm in Bassett, which is what brought me to Bradford County to look up some tax books. So I found South Creek Township. I found tax books from 1892 to 1883 to 1892, and there were a number of different tax books. You can see there's a little pile there. And I was kind of tracking down what Thomas Flood had that he was listing. Is that visible? Is it dark enough? It's a little washed out, but I don't know. All the lights matter, all the lights connected all on one switch. Okay, all right. So at the bottom you can see T.S. Flood down here. And T.S. Flood is listed as paying taxes on 196 acres. And over here in this column he has 6 horses, a mule or an oxen, and 3 cows, and their values are over here. So he's listed in this tax roll in Facet. And Facet was like a train. There was a train station and a little 4 corners there. Is anybody familiar with or from Facet? Have any connections? Okay. So it was a place where the train stopped out of Elmira. It just took a few minutes for Thomas Flood to get on the train and be down to his farm in Facet. So he kept a number of different horses there in Facet. Sometimes the tax rolls would list the horses on the light side, like 3 or 4 horses. Other times the news writer would be there and he'd say, oh, Thomas Flood's got 20 horses here. So there were different sources depending on who you were talking to about how many horses that Thomas Flood had out in Facet. But he owned this place for quite a while, from the late 1880s, mid 1880s until about 1910 or 1911. Thomas Flood had some money, and he would often put his race string of horses, some of which were sired by the Hambletonian horse belonging to the Woods. He would take the mares on the train to Knoxville after we got a rail station. We were late to get one. But first he would drive his mares over the road, and then when the rail station came, he would put them on the railway and take them to Knoxville. and he would have them bred and pay his money, and then he'd bring the mares back. It takes 11 months for a mare to give birth to a foal. So the mares would give birth here in Facet at Thomas Flood's barn. And then he owned them as long as he paid his fee, which he did. So he had, at various times, he had a number of young racing stock that he was training and shipping all around on the rails, because the heyday of the Grand Circuit big horse racing time was very much dependent upon rail service. So this fancy horse car, I just really enjoy looking at the line drawing of it. It has an alleyway and it has all these little stalls. It's all pre-made. It's called a Palace horse car. And so this is the kind of horse car that Thomas Flood's horses would ride in. It was pretty nice. Each one was divided so they didn't bump into each other or anything like that. And I think they could fit about, well, this one says 18. So they could fit a number of horses in there with the men to take care of them. This is a picture from, and I think this is a Mark Twain book. And this picture is not in my book because it's in another book. So I didn't try, but I'm just showing it here to show you how busy the Eastwater Street in Elmira, what it would have looked like in the day that Thomas Flood had his pharmacy there. And there were tram cars that ran on a rail, like a trolley car, for like cab service, passenger service. So it was really kind of busy and chaotic in those days, because you had horses and rigs, and then you had pedestrians, and the streets were still dirt, and then you had these trolley cars with clanging bells and ringing bells and everything. So you really did have to watch your step. This is a map of Chemung County, and Thomas Flood's drugstore was right along here. I believe it was called 412, and I didn't. But if you come up from the south and you're crossing over Lake Street Bridge up here, then you go along Water Street, and there's really not a lot there now. But back then there were all these businesses and storefronts. It was a very busy place. And I was surprised to see this old map, that these buildings and these businesses were all just packed right in here. So Thomas Flood's drugstore was right somewhere in the 400s here. And it looks from this map as though it backed right up to the water again. And that probably changed with a flood. I'm thinking. I don't know that for sure. I didn't track that down. But I think a lot of the Elmira area there, the downtown, changed. Not by choice, but by necessity. Let's see. I got that one out of order. Sorry about that. This is a map just about 2 blocks down between Madison and DeWitt. And now there's a big public housing project tower there. George Bragg Towers is there. But this is where the Flood family lived, in these dwellings here. And they had little horse barns and carriage houses and whatnot. And there were about 4 of them that lived all on this side of this block. And they lived a good life. They had money. This is a picture of Buffalo. Buffalo was another one of those big-time early race venues on the Grand Circuit. So they would put these horses on the train, and they would register them for a batch of horse races. Like they'd go to Buffalo, Rochester, Poughkeepsie, and then they'd go into Connecticut, and they'd make like a circuit, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and that kind of thing. And then eventually that circuit enlarged to include Cincinnati, Columbus, Ohio, a couple of venues down south. So these men would, like a rich man like Thomas Flood, would hire a batch of men to take his horses on the railway all summer long, and they would ride the rails and sleep in the cars with the horses, unload them, make sure they were cared for, train them, settle in at a new track pretty much every week. There was a race meet almost every weekend. So these men might leave home in May and go to Columbus, and they would go all around the nation. And in the 1890s up to about 1920, there would be a whole series of races, depending on how fast your horses were. It was interesting. I mean, people still do it with the trailers, but it isn't quite as intense as it was back then. Back then, it was equivalent to NASCAR or, the NFL. It had a big fan following. So this is Buffalo in the days of the high wheel sulky. So it's sometime before 1892, and many, many of the wood horse offspring ended up going to Buffalo at one time or another. And Thomas Flood's horses went to Buffalo as well. And New York State, Western New York State, had a very strong heritage of trotting horses. So these men would buy and sell from each other. They would buy stallions and mares and racing horses from each other. So pretty soon there was a network of men like Thomas Flood who were meeting up in the summer and going all kinds of places. This is the Chemung County Fairgrounds, where more of the Flood horses would race when they were close to home, which is, I think the fairgrounds is really all changed now, but there's still a Chemung County Fair, and I think there's still horses that train there. They don't have any races there anymore, but there are still men who train horses and live there and then take them further north. So this would have been how it was during the era that Thomas Flood was raising his horses, and the same era that Mark Twain was living there and writing Huckleberry Finn in the 1880s. One year, Thomas Flood had a beautiful young filly, and she was beautiful to look at, and she was very fast, and she was bred from the line of the Woods horse. She was a daughter of Woods Hambletonian, and he took her to Buffalo to a breeder's meet in the summertime. And this stockbroker, who was also very wealthy from New York City, came and he saw her and he just fell in love with her right there. He saw her race, he saw her run. She never won a race, a sanctioned race for money, but he saw her at the breeders' meet, and he approached Thomas Flood and he said, "How much do you want for her?" And Thomas Flood named a figure and he bought her. And it was a very high price at that point. It was more than $4,000. And she was a very young filly that had really very little experience. She had not really raced much at all. And Frank Work, he just bought her, took her home to New York City. And Franklin Work is really one of those interesting Gilded Age figures. And I had never heard his name, but he is a fifth great-grandfather to Princess Diana. And I just found that kind of interesting late one night when I was Googling. I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. I didn't know that she had American ancestors. Like, they just don't really come up on the news the way that the rest of all the royal family issues do. But he had a granddaughter, fourth great granddaughter. He had First, he had a stable, a very fancy stable in New York City across from Carnegie Hall. And horses were his hobby, and he was friends with the Vanderbilts and all the rich people in New York. And so he was particularly friends with William H. Vanderbilt, and they would race their horses in the city streets and through Central Park. And they had some accidents sometimes, and they ran over people, and various things went haywire racing through the streets like this. But they also had like a private club that they would go out to race these horses. So Frank Work was really one of these very wealthy men. When he passed away, they said his estate maybe was worth about $15 million, which was a lot in 1910. But I think it was not quite that much. But in the meantime, his family had a number of issues within and I'm having trouble with this. It's my mouse. Thank you. Okay. So I lost my train of thought. Anyway, his daughter was very beautiful, and she had a set of twins, and one of those twins became the grandfather to Diana. And this is a photo of Diana in her real life. I think they called her Granny Fermoy. And if anybody has watched that Netflix series, The Crown, which is kind of interesting and sort of strange. But anyway, they go through the life. The character of Granny Fermoy appears in 2 of those episodes. And Granny Fermoy was very much pushing the young Diana into the royal family's domain. So Granny Fermoy was the gal who was descended. She was married to Maurice, who was a grandson of Frank Work. So that's how Diana is connected to Frank Work. And of course, he never knew Diana, but he bought this horse. Back in Facet. In 1906, the barns burned in Facet, and that was around the time that Thomas Flood was sort of tiring of his horse hobby. And here it says that there were about 10 horses there and 15 cows. And I don't know that I don't know if anybody really remembers or has found very many traces of this. Supposedly there was a training track behind this place in Facet. There's a flat field there, but I can't really tell whether it would have been big enough to make a training track for horses or not. So by 1906, Thomas Flood was moving into other hobbies like oil and gas and politics a lot more and everything. He ran unsuccessfully for the nomination for New York governor. And there was quite a bit of that drama that played out, which happens in the chapter of the book called Mamie Wood, Pride in Politics, because Mamie Wood was the name of the mare that Thomas Flood kept, in addition to her sister, whom he had sold to Frank Work. Let's see, jumping chapters and jumping topics. This is a watercolor from East Aurora, is known as the home of Elbert Hubbard and the Roycroft movement. I don't know if any of you have heard of that, but it's this sort of ritzy little suburb outside Buffalo. Play School Toys or Fisher-Price Toys or whatever, yeah. And so this was a big powerhouse of standard bred breeding, again, owned by another really rich man. Just like now, it takes a lot of money to put horses out for show. And races of horses are an expensive hobby. And this is a watercolor done by Rix Jennings. And he attempted to capture the size and scope of what this farm was. And this man who owned this farm was also another one of those self-made men of the Gilded Age, like Frank Work, who started out with almost nothing and really made many times over fortunes in their lifetimes, amassed a huge amount of wealth. And his goal was to produce the fastest, most beautiful trotting horses that could be had. And if he didn't have them, he set out to buy them. And he made a journey to Knoxville, and he offered Mr. Wood a certain amount for the stallion. And they didn't make a deal. I don't know exactly why they didn't make a deal. Apparently they made counteroffers and whatnot and couldn't agree. But while this man, his name was C.J. Hamlin, Mr. Hamlin. While Mr. Hamlin was at the Woods Farm, he saw some other young stock that he also loved and admired and that he could afford. So he paid $250 for a young mare that was basically just, she was a filly still. She really was barely even broken. And he wanted her the worst kind of a way, but he also wanted her cheap. So there was always this going back and forth. He's got a lot of money, but he doesn't want to pay, whatever. So he paid $250 for a filly in 1881 when he went to the wood farm. And he named her Minoqua Maid. And I don't know why he named her Minoqua Maid, because Minoqua is over here. Minoqua is in near Canton and Alba. Yeah. So I have still a mystery on my hands. I don't know why a man from Buffalo would buy a horse from a man in Knoxville and name her Minoqua Maid. Pretty sure that Mr. Wood hadn't named her. She probably didn't even have a name. But anyway, Mr. Hamlin named her Minoqua Maid. Whether she ever ran, she never seemed to run in any real races. So that remains a mystery. But he brought her to this lovely farm, and she was a broodmare. And this is another watercolor that was reproduced on a calendar, which I do not have. It kind of shows the fanciness of the barn. And this is the stallion that Mr. Hamlin, I think Mr. Hamlin is sort of portrayed as the fellow in the green suit here. And Mr. Hamlin ended up buying this stallion for his collection. The stallion was called Mambrino King, and he was very, very good stallion. But he bought Minoqua Maid and bred her to this stallion. And she produced for him a number of horses over the years. She produced a foal for him almost every year. This is the fastest of those horses. She was also a mare, and they named her Nightingale. And a couple of horse people who have looked at this picture carefully say that that the way that this driver has her rigged up would probably be illegal now because it would be considered very cruel, particularly the bit arrangement that he has putting pressure on the top of her nose and her cartilage would probably be a no-no. So that they don't do this anymore. They're not allowed to race in horse races with this kind of contraption. But Nightingale was very, very fast. And this fellow here was a long-time trainer at Mr. Hamlin's farm. He was there for more than 20 years. And by this time, the racing rigs had changed. In 1892, they changed to bicycle-type tires with pneumatic wheels. And when they did that, all the race records fell the whole year. I mean, one guy started it in the Midwest, and within 3 months, everybody couldn't get enough of these bicycle sulky tires because they were so much faster. So it virtually changed their game. So I know it's after 1892 that he's driving with these tires. But he had a number of different ways. We know that she had a runaway. We know that she had a couple of wrecks. She was a very high-spirited, possibly difficult to control horse. She was probably, it would fall into the hot-blooded category or the scatterbrain category or something. So he was very good at what he did, and he was able to get her to race and settle down and behave by way of various contraptions and incentives. And she was very, very fast. And she also had another talent. She could keep up a really, really fast gait over a long period of time. And again, with animal rights and things like that, they won't do these long endurance races with horses anymore. They don't push them to the limit for long times. So this mare named Nightingale, I think she still holds the 3-mile record, because at that time they would do a race in mile heat, so it was always a mile record. But then they would have longer miles. They would race them for 3 miles, they would race them for 6 miles, they would race them for 12 miles, sometimes they'd race them for 50 miles, and it would be like a marathon, you know. So she was known for being very consistent until finally she had enough, which is I won't give that away as part of the story. This team is one from a family scrapbook, and this kind of shows what the Woods were continuing to do with their horses. They were dairy farmers. They started raising tobacco. They started to diversify. They weren't just horsemen. The rich men could afford to just rely on horses, but a regular farmer, like a guy from Bradford County or Tioga County who's trying to pay his bills and keep his land and keep his family roof over their head, had to diversify. So even though the stallion and the breeding was a lucrative sideline, the Woods always kept plenty of other things to rely on to keep their farms. And so this is an example of what one of their teams would have been. And these horses are kind of a good example of, and again, I apologize, they're a little bit washed out there. These horses are a good example of a draft crossover breed, which was very popular here among farmers, because a horse that's part trotter, part draft horse, meaning a heavy horse with a big foot and lots of bulk and muscle, could really serve a number of purposes. So it would be a smooth gait to pull your family wagon behind, but that same horse you can hitch to a plow, and he won't be as flighty like Nightingale, and he'll have the bulk to skid logs and plow and rake hay and really do what farmers need to do to pay their bills. So you had the fast horses that the rich men could use for sport, and hobbyists could use for sport. Many men needed a team, or depending on what they could afford. So these horses, this is a picture of a wood team. I don't know their names, but they appear to be half Percheron draft horse and probably half light horse. And they could theoretically have some of the Hambletonian blood in them. I don't know. They're not labeled. The big challenge always with historical photos is some are labeled, some are not. But I do know that they were that they were on the farm, and they're doing work. You can tell they've got a workhorse collar on, so they're going to have to pull some weight, do some work of some kind. This horse, jumping chapters here, I jump. This horse is in the last chapter. My storyline begins in 1861 and it ends about 1920 with this mare. Her name was Skeeter W., and she was bred in Knoxville several generations from Woods Hambletonian, sort of like 5, like myself from Mr. Wood and Diana from Mr. Work. She was about 4 generations from the Woods Hambletonian horse, and she ended up being owned in Bath, New York by a group of 4 businessmen, and they took her all over the nation, and she was a really, really good horse for them. And she was retired to be a broodmare and went to Philadelphia. And that sort of ends the storyline of my storyline on a note to wrap it up with. There were many, many horses. I think I found evidence of about 70 horses, at least, that were here with names and pedigrees that I could trace through the records. And I used a variety of sources. I came here, I went to the historical trotting museum out back in Goshen, and Goshen is very close to where the Woods had come from. So, and I had to really get a lot more up to speed on economics and dairy versus other kinds of crops, shifting as farmers were there in Orange County from dairy farming and sending butter into New York City during the early 1800s to shifting to breeding racehorses, because that was really a change in paradigm for the Orange County men. We went a variety of places. At first, I did the good old eBay buy a vintage book thing, and I did not know what this book was, and it's a very unattractive book. And I bought it because I had looked at some like this online. And when it came, I was really kind of disappointed. I was like, this thing is been eaten by silverfish, and it smells kind of funky, and I didn't know what to do with it. And I opened it up, and I couldn't really figure out what it was. It was like a code. And then I got it back out 2 or 3 months later, and we do tend to judge books by their covers. And I was like, oh, I don't know. I'm just not really sure what this is. But it has a lot of horse information in it, but it was like another language. I really did not understand what I was looking at. So what this really is called Wallace's Yearbook. And it's the annual publication of all kinds of horse racing facts and statistics from that year, the year that it was covering. This one was from 1890. It's called Wallace's Yearbook of Trotting and Pacing for the year 1890. And they published this book from like 1870 something until the 1940s. And every one of these little sticky notes that I went through, I have some pink and some green and some yellow. So every one of these sticky notes I found was connected to a wood horse. It was an offspring or something like that. So when I got down into the rabbit hole of this, and my husband thought I was never going to come up, I realized that there's a lot of information in here. So the first part of the book is the sort of the chronological happening of the results of every sanctioned race. So they had to send them in. So if they had a sanctioned race at Troy, which they did for a while at Troy Fair, that race chairman had to send all of his stats in to the national chairman, and he would publish them at the end of the year. And then there's an index to show you all the races that happened in Troy, whether or not they were part of the fair or whether they were another kind of meet. So this was a nationwide book, and through this you can track where a horse was taken on the train all around the country, if you want to. And then in the back is some cumulative tables having to do with the offspring of all the stallions and the mares and where they ended up. And so when I finally cracked the code of how to read this book, then it led me to a really intriguing Civil War story, which of course I had to figure that all out and how that fit in to a war horse that went south at the wrong time. And that was a key research tool. Over at the table I found, which you may look at, I found a picture, a booklet, premium booklet with the results of the Elmira Interstate Fair from the year 1890, which has some entries. Thomas Flood was a chairman of one of the committees, and some of his horses were entered in the races. And I have a couple of horseshoes from light horses. I have a vintage horseshoe from a draft horse. I have a calendar I got showing how the Amish people still use these trotting horses and pedigrees. They have very extensive network. So there's quite a market for the trotting horses, whether it's English style racing or whether it's Amish buggy horses. And I have a couple of other resources there. I'm very intrigued by the Minoqua connection. So if I'll still never really abandon the quest for trying to figure out why that horse was named Minoqua Maid. Do you have any questions for me? Do I have horses? I don't have horses now, which my husband is very grateful for. My first horse as a youngster was basically she flunked out off the racetrack. She was a trotting mare. She was a standard-bred mare with a tattoo on her neck. All I wanted at age 12 was to learn to ride. This is the worst horse probably that you could match with a 12-year-old novice, is a racetrack horse just cold off the track. And anyway, I didn't get hurt, and we learned a lot those couple of years. And then by the time I was about 14, I got a plug horse, which was really all my skill level was. A plug horse is just a very slow kind of lazy horse that will take you through the woods and not buck you off at every bird that flies or every breeze that blows. So I survived my horse phase pretty well. My parents were very patient. They were very patient and indulgent. And I've discovered that a lot of young girls go through a horse phase. It's real, and it's tangible. So you have to kind of wear it out. Some of my cousins have never worn out their horse phase, and they still ride. And one of my relatives who is a descendant from the woods, his name is Wood, and he's a first-class horseman of the cowboy type. We go to the horse races, and he says, "No, it's not really my kind of horse." But we've really enjoyed uncovering this part of our family's past. So it's kind of been an exercise in local social history, how the families were connected, how the economics were working. Barter economy when the Civil War was on. People weren't paying cash for things much at all. They were trading goods for services. A lot of things really outside the horse realm, but it sort of all connected. So I attempted to bring solid horse stories with facts and documentation to say that yes, it was real. I found in Sylvania that there was a man named Card who must have bought a horse from Mr. Wood. There were other people in Mansfield and Towanda who bought those horses as well, and they would take them to Mansfield and Wellsboro, and it seemed like from here, the man Mr. Flood was the most. He had the most money and the most kind of aura about him as far as being able to flaunt this horse racing thing on a local level. But yeah, are any of you horsemen? Cindy has horses. So yeah. Oh yes, I have too many of those. Well, thank you for being such a polite audience. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me, Matt. And again, I appreciate the research resources that I found here on my journey. And I'll be leaving a copy of the book here for Matt to put in the library collection here as well. So the books are for sale. They're $15 each. And they are for sale. I have a number of copies. So, and thanks again for listening. Thanks for coming tonight.